Someone collapses on a crowded street. Dozens of people are close enough to notice. And in the seconds that follow, something strange and predictable happens. Almost nobody moves. Not because the crowd is cruel, and not because they don't care. In fact, if that same person collapsed in front of a single passerby instead of a crowd, the odds of getting help go up dramatically. More witnesses should mean more help. Instead, it often means less. The presence of other people doesn't just fail to guarantee assistance, it actively suppresses it. And the mechanism behind that reversal says something uncomfortable about how your mind decides what an emergency actually looks like. In 1968, psychologists Bibb, Latané, and John Darley set out to understand why, after the murder of Kitty Genovese made headlines partly on the false claim that dozens of witnesses did nothing, so many people seemed to freeze in the presence of others. Rather than accept the easy explanation that people in cities had simply become numb or indifferent, they designed an experiment to test something more specific. They had participants fill out a questionnaire in a room that slowly began filling with smoke, seeping in through a vent. When participants were alone in the room, the vast majority reported the smoke promptly, usually within 2 minutes. When participants sat with 2 other people who had been quietly instructed to ignore the smoke entirely, continuing their questionnaires as though nothing were happening, the numbers collapsed. Most participants sat there too, breathing increasingly hazy air, saying nothing, doing nothing, for the full 6 minutes of the experiment. What's happening in that room isn't apathy. It's a kind of accidental deception, one the group performs on itself without anyone intending to. Latané and Darley called part of this pluralistic ignorance, and it works like this. When something ambiguous happens, smoke filling a room, a stranger slumped against a wall, a raised voice from a nearby apartment, your first move isn't usually to act. It's to check. You glance at the people around you to gather information about how alarmed you should be. The problem is that everyone else is doing the exact same thing at the exact same moment. And because genuine alarm looks a lot like panic, and panic is slightly embarrassing to display in public, most people default to a calm, composed expression, while they themselves are checking everyone else. What you see, scanning the room, is a group of calm faces. What you don't see is that every one of those calm faces is a mask worn by someone equally uncertain, equally scanning, equally waiting for someone else to move first. The room convinces itself, collectively and wrongly, that nothing is wrong, using nothing but the borrowed calm of people who are actually just as confused as you are. That alone would be enough to explain a slower response. But Latané and Darley found something else running underneath it, something that persisted even after the ambiguity was removed entirely. In a follow-up study, they had participants believe they were having a discussion over an intercom with either one other person or several others, when in fact, all the other voices were pre-recorded. Partway through, one of the recorded voices began simulating a seizure, distress, an unmistakable request for help. There was no ambiguity here. Everyone could hear exactly what was happening. And yet the number of people who left the room to get help dropped sharply as the number of supposed witnesses increased. When participants believed they were the only other person on the call, nearly everyone helped, and most helped within a minute. When participants believed 4 other people were also listening, fewer than a third helped at all within the same window. And some never helped for the entire duration of the recording. This is the part that should genuinely unsettle you, because there was nothing left to misread. The emergency was completely clear. What changed wasn't a person's understanding of the situation. It was the weight of personal responsibility sitting on any single set of shoulders. Latané and Darley called this diffusion of responsibility, and the logic underneath it is almost mathematical in its coldness. When you're the only witness, the entire obligation to act rests on you alone, with total clarity and nowhere to hide from it. When 4 other people are equally capable of acting, that same obligation gets quietly divided, and each person's individual share of it shrinks, even though the total amount of responsibility in the room hasn't actually changed at all. Nobody consciously decides that someone else should handle it. The sense of personal urgency simply dilutes on its own, the way a single drop of dye disappears once it's stirred into a much larger volume of water. Why would a mind work this way? The answer, once again, traces back to a world built around small, tightly bound groups rather than anonymous crowds. For most of human history, the people around you during a crisis weren't strangers. They were people you knew by name, people whose individual capacity to help you could actually track and evaluate. In a group of 5 familiar people, you could reasonably assess who was closest, who was strongest, who had already started moving, and adjust your own response accordingly, because the responsibility genuinely was shared in a way you could see and calculate. That calibration made sense in a small, known group. It becomes a liability the moment you drop it into a crowd of strangers, where nobody actually knows who else might step in, and the diffusion that once helped coordinate a response among people who trusted each other instead becomes a reason for everyone to quietly assume someone else, somewhere in the crowd, is already handling it. There's a final piece to this that reframes the whole phenomenon. None of the participants in either study were bad people making a calculated choice to ignore someone in danger. Follow-up interviews found that the ones who didn't help weren't indifferent. They were often visibly distressed, uncertain, caught in exactly the kind of internal conflict a decent person would be caught in. They just didn't act on it, because the psychological signals telling them it was specifically their turn to act simply never arrived strongly enough to move them. The bystander effect isn't a story about apathy. It's a story about a coordination system that was built for small groups of people who could see and track each other clearly, now running inside crowds of strangers where that tracking has quietly stopped working, and nobody in the crowd can tell that it has. Which means, the next time you're part of a crowd standing near something that might be wrong, the most useful thing you can know isn't that people are heartless. It's that the system inside you is waiting for a signal that, in a crowd of strangers, will very often never come, unless you happen to be the one who decides to send it first.